So welcome officially to our latest GameShift pop-up. We're delighted that you're able to join. And I'm Philippa Hardman, I'm one of the co-founders. And Chris, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. And I'm just delighted we're doing this because, as you know, for a while we've been running a series of pop-ups basically on one of our core questions, which is how do we do better, more rigorous, more effective work in the HR, OD and learning space. And this one is very much part of this series. I mean, we've known Jules for a very long time, GameShift partner, and I also know Jules as Fuchsia Blue and all the brilliant stuff you do with Shindiggery and unconferences and goodness knows what else. And it's brilliant to have you here. And Rob, you and I first connected on Twitter when it was Twitter. And I have learned so much from your debunking of various things and presenting of all kinds of things over the years. And I'm just delighted that we've got you here to do this with us today. So I'm going to get out of the way and let Jules introduce this session properly. Jules.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. We've just had a bit of a pre-chat, and I was saying to everybody that I'm currently at the Learning Technologies Conference in Excel in London. And I said to Rob, it is a hotbed of need, I think, for some evidence-based practice. There's lots of claims being made around AI, some of them potentially right, others not. So we might get into some of the AI conversation as we go through this morning. But in the spirit of being at the Learning Technologies Conference, Rob, I put an AI request into ChatGPT to write your intro. So you can tell us whether ChatGPT is working off the right evidence or not. You are currently a professor at Queen Margaret University of London.
That's already wrong. Queen Mary.
Queen Mary.
That's not the AI.
That's human error. Queen Mary University of London. You serve as the scientific director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Management, and your influential work has earned you recognition as one of HR Magazine's most influential UK thinkers. Your extensive research and practical insights have significantly shaped how organizations approach decision-making in HR and change management. You emphasize the importance of grounding HR practices in robust evidence, steering clear of fleeting trends and unproven methods. Your contributions have been instrumental in integrating evidence-based principles into professional HR standards, including the HR Profession Map. And I also know you to be a disruptor and occasionally poker of thoughts. So how has ChatGPT done?
Not too bad, not too bad. Pretty accurate. I was scientific director at the Centre for Evidence-Based Management, but I stopped doing that a few years ago. But also co-founder of it. But in general, yeah, it's pretty good. It didn't mention I also now work about half time at university and half time at Corporate Research Forum. So I didn't pick up on that, but apart from that, it's pretty good.
Nice. All right. So I'm going to hand over to you. I think you've got some slides and intro into the conversation.
Yeah.
For those of you who are here and listening, please use the chat for any questions that you have. There will be questions that come up, but please also feel free to stick on your mics and chat to us too if you have questions. It is always better if we hear from all of you as well as the two of us. So Rob, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jules. So yeah, just to reiterate what Jules just said, I am very happy to take questions now as we go through. Any comments, thoughts you have. I've just thought I'd do a short presentation at the beginning, about 10 minutes or maybe 15, because one of the challenges I find talk about evidence-based practice is, I guess everyone has in their head already an idea about what it means, what evidence means, what being evidence-based means. And quite often it's not what I mean by it. So I just thought it might help the conversation to clarify what I mean when I kind of use that kind of expression, and a little bit about, I guess, also where evidence-based practice as an idea actually, I think, came from. So I'd like to first sort of think about this problem or this challenge. And I'd like you to imagine, if you have to imagine, that you are very, very interested in food and eating. And I use this example because for me, it's a good everyday example of something that's really, really important to me. You know, I don't know if you are, I'm already thinking about lunch I'm thinking about dinner tomorrow, I'm thinking about what I'm going to eat at the weekend. It's really important to me. And this, I think, is an example that exemplifies some of the main principles, I think, of evidence-based practice. So imagine if you arrive in a large European city, let's say Amsterdam, you check into your hotel, and when you get to the room, your host say, look, you can choose any restaurant you like, because they know you love eating. It can be any price, anywhere in the city. They're going to pay. They really want you to choose because they're going to host you. And if you do really, really enjoy eating, how would you decide which restaurant to book? So again, you may think of other examples that are more relevant to you, something that's important to you. But again, if you think through this example, sitting in this hotel room, are you more likely to get a good meal if you use no evidence or some evidence, clearly some evidence? Are you more likely to get a good meal if you use one or multiple? Certainly, I would tend to use multiple sources. I might look at TripAdvisor, though 0.3 here I don't think is very reliable, but I might look at it. I might talk to friends, I might look at newspaper reviews, I might look at Time Out, I might look at the Guide Michelin, whatever. I look at different sources, but also 0.3, I want to think, is this information trustworthy? How trustworthy is it? And prioritize the stuff that's more trustworthy. And again, I would tend to take a structured approach, even making a list of restaurants that keep popping up and sort of cut and pasting what different reviews and different sites have said about it. Because in this context, it's really important for me to get a good dinner. And I think this example is important because it really shows some of the main principles of evidence-based practice. And often people wonder where it came from. Is it like a science thing? Is it a technical thing? Is it about doing experiments? No, it's essentially doing not what everybody does, but what most of us do if we're trying to make a decision that's really important. We will use evidence. We'll use multiple sources, we'll think about how trustworthy it is, and we'll tend to take a structured approach. So that's the sort of basis of which I'm going to revisit these principles in a minute, because for me, it's the principles that are the most important here, rather than which particular model you actually use, I think. If we just take a step back, I know this is a sort of HR, OD, and some other things kind of audience, but if you step back and think what's the purpose of any profession, it's essentially to help clients and customers. And one way of thinking about how we can most effectively do that is to say, what are the most important issues that our clients and customers are facing, and what can we do that's most likely to resolve those issues? And that to me runs right across, I think, most kinds of professions. And essentially, the more accurate our understanding of those two things, the more effective we're going to be. So essentially, it's that simple. It's just saying we are trying to do the best and focus on what's important for clients and do what's likely to help them resolve it in some way. And that's kind of it. That's all it's about. And evidence-based practice has kind of evolved in many different fields to sort of help practitioners do that. So these are some of the fields that have used the term evidence-based. So evidence-based architecture, evidence-based conservation, evidence-based design. And what is interesting, I think, is that in general, the principles are exactly the same. So it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with something which sounds very technical, like software engineering or medicine, or whether you're dealing with something like architecture or design or policy making or social work, which feels a bit softer, the principles are effectively the same. I think that's a very important point, actually, about what evidence-based practice is. So if you think about HR and possibly, I mean, OD is a different thing in a way, maybe we'll get onto that, but if you think about HR specifically, I think there have been these historical and ongoing concerns about is HR helping the business? And again, I would argue, how can we do better? Going back to doing those two things, improving understanding of what the most important issues are for our clients, the organizations, the businesses we work with, and thinking what's most likely to resolve it. And I guess the good news in a way for my message that I've been banging on about for about 30 years is that I think there's much more acceptance now within HR that actually doesn't always make very well informed decisions about what it's doing. And it doesn't, which means in the end, it's not as effective as it could be, I think. So there's now much more widespread acceptance of that, I think. So I'm just going to talk about the principles, give you one example, then I'm going to stop talking. But this is a process essentially that delivers more informed and more accurate answers to those two questions again. To put it really simply, what's going on and what can we do about it? That's often the way I tend to think about it. And those questions are answered through a combination of the best available evidence and critical thinking. There are those three principles again: multiple sources, structured approach, thinking about the most trustworthy. And I'm going to break those down a little bit now. So the first thing we're thinking about, I suppose, is about incorporating multiple sources of evidence, and think about how often you actually do that. So I think we all tend to a bit, but probably not very consciously. And again, a lot of this is about making a conscious decision to follow a process or to follow some principles. So we sometimes use some, we sometimes maybe use a couple, but we don't necessarily really think about a need to look at multiple sources to understand what the issue is and what we can do about it. And within HR and I think OD, it's worth thinking about what the main sources are. But I'm just going to give you a little example here about why it's important to use multiple sources. So if you imagine you're not feeling well, you go to see your family doctor. If you can imagine going to see your doctor, can you imagine that as currently in the UK? So I've just actually been trying to make an appointment and it's just amazing. But anyway, but imagine you go and see them and your doctor says to you, she's going to diagnose what's wrong with you and treat you only by using data from you. Things like blood tests, MRI scans, CT scans, and other diagnostics. She's going to completely ignore all evidence from medical science, her professional expertise as a doctor, and also what you as the patient or stakeholder believe and feel. That's essentially a good example of if you focus on one source, you would not think that doctor was going to be very effective in her work. And interestingly, in the context of HR, that's precisely what people who really focus on data analytics and HR analytics tend to do. They focus very, very heavily on just internal data and tend to ignore all those other things. So if you can see from this example, this idea why multiple sources is so important. So again, it's worth thinking about what are the main sources and types of evidence and evidence-based HR. What is interesting about this is when people hear the word evidence, and it's not a very helpful term, they tend to think of quantitative data, particularly kind of maybe from scientific research and so on. But actually, within evidence-based HR and evidence-based practice in general, there's actually quite a wide range of sources. There's at least 4: the stakeholder views, your expertise and the expertise of other people in the business or organization, evidence from inside the organization, and scientific and other external evidence. So this is just an example starting on the top right. Stakeholder views, it might be senior management, it might be employees at all kinds of levels, it might be customers and clients. So what do they think about what is the issue, and if there is one, what we do about it? Second is professional expertise, yours, your teams, maybe external professional expertise from other fields. Again, what's the issue, what can we do about it? The third is evidence from inside the business, the classic HR metrics already mentioned, but things like perceptions, structures and processes. Maybe you've tried things out and you've got the results of those from inside the organization. And fourth is external, different kinds of external evidence. It could be peer-reviewed scientific publications, other kinds of scientific evidence, could be kind of benchmarking data and case studies as well. So I hope you can see from this, because one concern people often have is, oh, is this all about doing experiments, quantitative data? Absolutely not. It is absolutely not about that. So it's about getting these multiple sources. Again, if you think back to the family doctor example, I'm sure you can see why it can never be just about one source. It doesn't make any sense, or at least to me it doesn't. The second is this structured and explicit approach. Why is this kind of important? I think one reason, I'm not going to go into these now necessarily, is that it's, and Jules mentioned it in the introduction, or maybe it was before we started, that we want to use evidence, and even when we have it, we seem to sort of not necessarily use it. And I think one challenge in evidence-based practice is I find everyone sort of understands the principles. They're not very complicated, like choosing a nice restaurant that you're going to enjoy the dinner. It's not really that difficult as an idea, but it's very difficult. And one reason for that is there are lots and lots of barriers. So including things like our own biases, politics and power, incentives, what are we actually rewarded for, things like fads and fashions that Chris mentioned. I'm often trying to sort of call out and say, wait a minute, this sounds great, but we don't really know yet. Maybe misconceptions, a lot of good intentions stuff. And on the right-hand column, the emboldened one, practitioner theatre. And again, I don't know your experience of this, but certainly if I look around at what practitioners are doing, say in HR, and ask them what they're doing, it seems to me not at all uncommon that what they're doing is doing stuff that looks like they're doing something. So it's theatre, it's performative, whether it's around performance management or talent management or well-being or DEI, it's stuff to give the impression. Because if you say, what is the issue you're trying to resolve here, or opportunity, and why have you chosen this? Often there isn't much of an answer. And again, I wouldn't necessarily blame individual practitioners for that. Often it's because that's what they're rewarded for doing. In a sense, a lot of us, I would say, including in my job, particularly my academic job, we're rewarded for doing stuff. We're not rewarded for doing important stuff that's effective. And that's a real challenge and the barrier. So that's why I think a structured approach, just another example of why it's important. And I'll break this down in a minute. This is just a model I developed recently with CRF. But again, it's just focusing on what's the issue and going through a set of steps and what can we do about it if you do discover an issue. And so I'll break that down in a minute later. The third principle is to focus on the most trustworthy and relevant evidence. Again, it's worth reflecting on how often you do this. Whatever source of evidence you've got, it's quite likely some of it's quite trustworthy and relevant. Some of it is probably far less trustworthy and relevant. And the idea is we should really focus on the most trustworthy. So why? Well, it's because we're surrounded by data and evidence. You could argue in some contexts, most of it is just not trustworthy or relevant. Some of it is maybe not relevant. And if you include that, it will not lead to better informed decisions, but actually less well-informed decisions. So taking an explicit and conscious step to say, all this stuff is probably noise. I don't know where it comes from. I can't trust it. Let's focus on what's more likely to be trustworthy and relevant is also a very important part of this principle. So back to the restaurant example, I wouldn't place much emphasis on TripAdvisor. And that's for all kinds of reasons, part of the experience. I wouldn't emphasize or place much trust in a concierge in a hotel recommending a restaurant, because my understanding is they often get kickbacks for recommending restaurants. I might ask them, but I might say, well, you know, there's probably reasons why they're recommending this particular restaurant rather than others. So just to sort of pull things together now, I'm going to just give you a very quick example of applying this model, just the first part of it, to the presenting problem. So if an organization says, you know, we've got a problem with high employee turnover, okay, that's fine. How do we go about it? You can see at the top of this model is awareness of important business issue. So the idea is it always starts off with an awareness of something that may be an issue. It could be an opportunity too for the organization. So we don't just start off with doing stuff. We start off with what is important, what might be important for this organization. And these are the 6 steps. You ask questions, you gather the evidence, you rate how trustworthy it is, and that can be done very kind of simply and crudely. It doesn't really matter, just to emphasize some rather than others. Put it together and answer the question of what is the issue, and then reflect on that process. So this is the kind of questions you would ask in the case of a turnover problem. What exactly is it? Where is it happening? Who actually is leaving? What is the rate or the trends? How does the turnover rate compare? Why is it a problem? So these are the kinds of questions you'll start to look across those 4 sources to kind of answer. You look across them, you start to gather the evidence, you record the answers to the questions you got from those different sources. You then think about the trustworthiness. So do we understand it? How is it gathered? Is it going to be biased or incomplete? Is it credible? How do we know? Given our questions, which evidence is most trustworthy? Given our questions, which evidence is most relevant? And then almost do a triage. Yeah, we should definitely use this, possibly use this, and probably not use that. Pull it together to answer those questions and ultimately get to the point is what actually is the issue. So we started off with this idea of turnover, but is there really a problem? Is it a big problem? Is it a small problem? Is it one problem? Is it several problems? And how serious is it? Do we actually need to do anything or not? And then reflect on the process and the decision outcome, thinking about, do we do it all? Do we do some of it? Did we follow the process or not? Are we confident? Those kinds of questions. So, and then you do the same for if you did identify a turnover problem or problems, you do exactly the same to think about interventions, 2.1 to 2.6, and then you'd implement whatever intervention you thought might be effective and think about how you'd evaluate that. So that's effectively is the process, those steps. So I'm just going to conclude now by talking about some of the, and then I'll stop sharing my screen, some of the benefits, I think, of evidence-based HR, evidence-based practice, actually in lots of professions, I would argue. The overarching benefit is to help us be more effective in helping the organisation. That seems to me the most thing. If we're better at saying what is going on and what can we do about it, we're much more likely to make a difference that's important and relevant to the organisation. It helps us focus on business issues rather than just doing stuff, because we always start with the business issue. It helps us mitigate risks in relation to if we discover what the issue is, it really helps us understand what actually is a risk for the organisation and maybe what isn't. So it helps us to focus on where the risks are. It allows us to prioritise. We can't do everything. And again, my experience of working with HR functions is they're almost invariably just doing too much, a lot of which is quite low value. So how can you prioritize? Well, this is one way of doing it. It decreases the value and credibility of HR, I think. It also reduces the waste of resources. And particularly, I think important for me is this goodwill resource. Again, a common complaint, which I think is sometimes quite reasonable, is that HR functions are seen as the people that just tell you to do stuff. You have to do this training. You have to do this annual performance appraisal. And people think, what is this for? What is it about? And they're actually asking really good questions. Quite often they don't get a good answer, so they get quite skeptical and cynical, and that goodwill drains away. And that's, but it helps reduce this waste, I think, and so on. And also, really importantly, it enhances ethical standards. It seems to me astounding that within HR and OD and other people, practitioner organizations, it seems to me astounding that people will go in and implement a solution without actually knowing if there is a problem initially, what it is, and without really knowing where that solution is effective or not. And the ethics of that are obviously generally, absolutely, in my view, appalling, but it seems to be quite common, even in areas like wellbeing, that you just say, yeah, we don't really know what the issue is. We'll just do all this stuff and hope some of it works. That's pretty unethical, I would argue. And also, finally, I think one thing it does, it helps the learning and development of the HR function. In other words, I think by going through this process iteratively multiple times for different sorts of business issues, you will get better as a function at focusing on what the organization needs and focusing on things that are more likely to help. In other words, it helps you get better at doing your role in a way that I think doing other kinds of development don't particularly. Okay, thank you. I'll stop there and I'm happy to chat, have questions or whatever you would like.
Well, just a really practical one to start with from Helen in the chat. Wants to know if the slides are going to be shared.
Yes, the slides can be available, and also I think in the stuff that was sent around, I think I sent a link to this Corporate Research Forum report, which goes into this stuff in a bit more detail. Yes, they'll all be available. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to start with trustworthiness and being in what feels like a very much like sort of post-truth world at the moment. The slightly twisty thing that feels like it's going on at the moment, where even though there's evidence that X should be happening or would be wise, we don't, or there's systems or procedures that are set up to take us in completely the opposite direction. And what's your view or your experience on that?
Yeah. So I think, let's use the opposite example of Donald Trump. In his first presidency, I didn't
directly allude to him.
No, but I think it's a good example. His first presidency, he actually at one point asked for all federal documents across different government departments to try and remove the word evidence, which is pretty interesting to your post-truth world stuff. And I think that's about power and incentive. So I think if someone's, and it could be a manager, it could be anyone, not so the president of the United States, but if someone just says, you have to do this because I say so, you're in a world where evidence-based practice is just not going to work. And I think it's something I feel I've learned over time is that evidence-based practice, including evidence-based HR, there are some contexts where it can make a contribution, other contexts where it just can't. And I think if you're in working with, if you like, post-truth people just telling you to do stuff, the motivation for, I think, questioning evidence and data from the post-truth perspective is because people in that position just want to do things and they're not interested in not doing those things they've decided to do. So it doesn't, in fact, matter what data evidence you have, they're just still going to do those things. And that happens in organizations just as much, I think. So it feels a bit of an odd time to be talking about this in a way, but I think it was ever thus in a way. But it's about saying, to repeat, in what situations this approach likely to be seen as valuable and helpful, and I can do it. In which situations can I not? So one example, then I'll stop. One example is I do quite a lot of work because that's my background with work psychologists and organizational psychologists. And a lot of them are kind of relatively freelance. They work with clients. Clients say to them, oh, can you come and run an assessment center next month? And obviously it's a good evidence-based psychologist, you'd say, oh, why do you want to run an assessment centre? What's the issue? You know, can we talk about that? And they go, well, no, we decided to run an assessment centre. Do you want to do it or not? Because if you don't want to do it, there's another 100 organisational psychologists I can ask. So that's a situation where evidence-based practice just is not really going to help, and it's up to you whether you take that job or not. Maybe you have to, but yeah, there's no point in banging on about it in that situation, I think.
Yeah, and Tim's just made a great point in the chat about the sort of return to the office policies.
Yes.
And do you want
Yeah.
to say a bit more about that? Like, what's your thinking behind the question?
Yeah, so I think it's just a good example where people have already decided often what they want to happen, and then just cherry pick stuff that supports it, including, I'll say, lots of academics in this field, and some quite prominent researchers who've done experiments, and then in my view make really exaggerated claims about what those experiments mean and how applicable they are to everyone. So I think there is a lot of sort of bias in that. And I think it's also a good example of where people don't know what the question is they're trying to answer. So they know where they want to get to. I want everyone back. I want hybrid. Fine. But what's the problem or issue or opportunity here? And that's what's often missed. And then they'll throw out things like, oh, blah, blah, innovation, blah, blah, water cooler.
Yeah,
Blah, blah.
the expense of empty offices.
Yes, exactly. They throw out things that sort of justify the position they've already taken. But I think that's a really good example of not taking a step back. And also it's a really good example where a lot of the issues the hybrid versus return to office debate exposed is issues that were there for a long time. So many of us before COVID were working kind of, you know, sometimes remotely, sometimes flexibly anyway. So it wasn't a new thing, but I guess it just really heightened it. And again, employees asking reasonable questions like, well, I was working at home for X years or X months, and you said I was doing fine, and now you're telling me I'm not doing fine? What is this? So again, it's sort of mismanagement of that process as well, I think. But yeah, I think it's a really good example of, I know what I want, I will find evidence that supports this thing I want, and not saying what's the problem opportunity we're trying to deal with here.
Sure. Tim, can I bring you in a little bit on this? What was kind of behind the question?
Yeah, no, look, I completely agree with you, Rob, and I think my experience sort of twofold in my own organization. Our CEO initially was completely want everyone back. His preference was very much in person because he liked to be in the office. He liked having people around him. And to his credit, and to my chief people officer's credit, he did listen to us and the evidence we put forward to say, well, hold on, before we make that decision, let's think through what is it we're actually trying to achieve by doing that? What are the consequences? So for me, it was a good example where we were able to influence, not so much with evidence, but just the questioning to get him to really think through the problem. But then I have heard other horror stories from other organizations, and I think the extremes that some organizations seem to be going to now, some of you might have read something in Forbes this week around, you know, is this ultimately a power trip, right? A control thing from senior management, and some of the tracking and monitoring procedures that are being put in some organizations I hear about just horrify me. The principles of, where's the trust in that organization if you're literally tracking people into the office every day now? So it does feel like, as you say, in this sort of post-truth world, some senior management teams just seem to be getting away with stuff that you wonder where the HR function is in those conversations, I guess, is my observation.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that situation sounds like you're lucky enough to have a CEO and a CPO who were prepared to ask questions. And I think it's always a sort of warning sign to me. People obviously don't even want to ask good questions about what the situation is there. And also I think it's this, again, back to, for example, the idea of innovation. So you hear vaguely very sometimes powerful people who are supposed to be very smart say, oh, I'm really worried about innovation. And then you kind of think, have you actually looked at whether innovation is a problem? Have you looked at what actually helps support it? Now, take it seriously. If you think there's an issue with innovation, or maybe it's with socialization of new people, or maybe it's incidental learning. understand what that issue is first, and then see what's going to help. And it may have nothing to do with hybrid policies or everything to do with it, but it's taking those questions seriously, saying if that's an issue for us, let's find out. Well, let's find out if it is, what's most likely to help resolve it. Yeah.
And we've got a big statistic in the chat.
Oh yes, Amanda. Yeah.
Amanda, can you say a wee bit more?
Yeah.
If you're okay to.
Yeah, absolutely fine. Some of it, I think, is about where the power now lies. Does it lie with the organisation and its requirements, or does it lie with potential candidates? We have had multiple situations with roles in finance, new product development, and HR, where candidates have said, if you're not going to allow me to work on a hybrid basis, then I'm not interested. So I'm putting that down to power, but that is a massive, massive statistic that my organisation has had to accept, that we've potentially lost some great candidates because we don't offer hybrid working.
Yeah, and also maybe, Amanda, I don't know, it could be that situation because you're a manufacturing organisation. It could be that classic thing of senior management feeling it's not fair to offer this really hybrid way of working to some staff and not to others. Now, I don't know enough about it or this context, but it may be those people who can't work in a hybrid way just don't care, or it may be they think it's outrageous and really unfair, and in which case it sort of makes sense to say, we're going to really make these people feel being treated badly if we allow big chunks of people to work in a hybrid way. But yeah, but it might be nothing to do with that. It might just be power. Yeah.
I'm going to come to your point, Chris, in a second. But Amanda, Rob, in that situation, to what extent is the evidence influential? Can we use it as a point of changing the decision, or is it just the power play? Where does it kind of stop in your view?
You want to go ahead, Amanda? What do you think?
I think it's a power situation. My organisation accepted that we were losing good candidates as a result of this policy, and that recruitment was taking a lot longer, and in one situation took up to 8 months for a finance role.
You can show them that it's taking longer. You can show them that you're losing good candidates, and still,
the decision was no hybrid working.
And can they show what the benefit is of not having hybrid working?
The organisational view is that it's about team building, it's about fairness, it's about effective communication.
Yeah, and even if you take team building again, it's actually, well, what actually helps? Just throwing people in an office doesn't help team building. So, and similarly with the fairness thing, I would say, well, what is the evidence that it is? And it could be being perceived as very unfair. What are the consequences of that? Does it mean people in the man who can't work in hybrid way are quitting? That seems unlikely. And also, even if it is that, there's other ways of handling unfairness or perceptions of unfairness, like explaining why these people work in a different way to you, which if you explain it effectively, it may well help people's sense of unfair to go, okay, I get it now. Yeah, I don't like it, but I can see it's not unfair. There's other reasons for doing it. So it feels like, yes, there's lots of unanswered questions there.
I think, Rob, there's a lack of rationality.
Yeah.
As well, between different levels of personnel within the organisation. Because some people, even if you explain why you're doing it, will still say, but it's not fair as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to pause there. I'm sure we'll come back to it. Amanda, keep chucking stuff in the chat. I'm going to go, Chris, with your story. And then Steve's made a really kind of excellent point about the framing of all of this in the chat as well.
Well, so mine's probably a fairly small point, really. I was just coming back on the back of the comment about power and control. And it just reminded me, I mean, Philippa and I years ago worked with the Cochrane collaboration, which does meta-analysis in medical and clinical work. We've worked with them for many years. And the story of their founding is amazing because Sir Ian Chalmers was the founding chief exec or president or director, and he was the obstetrician who had the radical idea of asking women what their experience of obstetrics was. Yeah, because up till that point there was a strong evidence base that episiotomy had to be a poor approach to birthing, and the only people who were ever asked about whether this was good practice or not were obstetricians, who were 99% men. And when the evidence base of whose voices do we listen to was widened, the whole practice was changed, and that that evidence-based approach changed the way obstetrics was done and led to the formation of the Cochrane collaboration.
Yeah,
Just a nice story, and it's so much about whose voice do we hear? Where do we go with the evidence? And organizational work is one of the few places that the divine right of kings still runs rampant. So
yeah, and I think it's Chris, it's a really good example of the idea of actually asking, for other perspective, asking stakeholders what they think. And when I'm doing training around evidence-based HR and evidence-based management, I often use the example of you might get lots of organizational data, or you might try something, it doesn't seem to be effective, and it could be you go and have a few conversations with people in a different context, and suddenly the penny drops. You go, right, that is the real problem, or that's why this isn't working, or that's why. And now obviously you can investigate it further. A single conversation isn't a good source of data. The insight that provides is often, I think, quite underestimated, particularly I think in the age of big data or HR analytics. Actually going asking questions to people, stakeholders can just give incredible insights about what the issue is and what you can do about it, which is often underestimated. I think, and particularly it's done sometimes, but it's done in a very informal way. It's not part of a structured process, which is the important thing here, which is why in this case, the example you've given, this particular person chose to go and actually talk to it. Whereas now, hopefully, that would have changed. It would just be a routine part of the way you think about this stuff, not a sort of just one person decided to do it. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm quite keen to go to Steve's question.
Yeah.
I'm sitting there for 5 minutes, and Steve, because we're recording this, can you and folk who hear the recording won't see the question, can you just reframe all of that for us? Oh, we can't hear you terribly well. And that feels important. I can read your question out, but
right, is that any better?
hey,
Yeah.
hello.
Don't know why my headphones are taking the audio. So it's Rob, your approach, you frame the approach as evidence-based HR, and I really love it. And yet everything you describe, I can see as being fundamentally about change that spans leadership, OD&D, transformation, HR, and more. So I'm interested in how, well, actually, I've made some more notes, actually. Firstly, to what extent does this create the conditions for leaders to discount the importance of what you're saying? It's an HR thing. HR deal with this. It's not a wider systemic organizational change thing or a leadership question. It's HR. So if it's evidence-based HR, well, you go and sort that HR. Then connected to that is kind of the splitting off that happens. If I give it to HR, I don't have to worry about it. And that got me then thinking about the anxiety and a paradox potentially here. So when I hear you talk, I'm thinking at one level, this potentially might manage anxiety, because people will go, okay, let's actually find out what the problem is and what the data is, so we can see things more clearly. But paradoxically, what you're also saying to people is, I want you and we need to engage with the mess. And one of the things, certainly from my own research, is that leaders often don't want to do that. That's what leads them to go and look for simple solutions. So there's this kind of tension I'm wondering whether there is, which is, on the one hand, you might be managing anxiety, and on the other hand, you're going to flare it.
Thank you. Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is I'm today talking about evidence-based HR, but I also do talk to managers in general about evidence-based management, and I talk to police services about evidence-based policing and psychology about evidence. So this is just an example, David, but you're absolutely right. In the context of an organization, it would be pretty hard for a HR function to be evidence-based if the leadership wasn't. So I think that's a real challenge, and particularly around, again, the stuff I've done with senior managers or senior management teams. Quite often, one of the questions I ask is how much of your time do you spend making decisions for the business, the organization? Oh, like 60%, 70%. I say, okay, fine. How many of you have ever had training in decision making? You know, almost nobody, unless they happen to be in the services or maybe a safety critical organization. They've had no job. So it's not interesting. So you spend 6% of your time, you have a very responsible job, you pay quite a lot of money, and the thing you spend a lot of time doing is decision making, but you just do it. Yeah, you just do it. So I think the one thing is that underappreciation of why seeing it as a skill and something you can get better at doing is often not really seen. But to your point, yes, I think leadership and management, senior management, have to do this as well. So yes, it's not just about HR, absolutely not. And the other point you made, which is very interesting about mess and anxiety, is, again, when I'm sort of trying to sort of train this kind of stuff, quite often I'll say, you know, a common thing, if you get evidence from these multiple sources and try and really answer your questions, what is the issue, what we can do about it, often you don't really get an answer. And to your point, that can create more confusion, you know, as in, this hasn't made me feel less, it's made me feel more anxious, or it depends how you frame it. I often say, if you're confused, that's probably right. If you're not confused, you're not thinking hard enough. So that state of confusion, there being multiple answers, and again, I always remind people, why do you think there is going to be an answer? This is not a Sudoku. It's not a crossword puzzle. It's not simple arithmetic. There isn't an answer. There is not an answer. But what that speaks to is, I think, the fact that in this context, HR professionals are constantly being given answers. Here's an answer. Here's a solution. Well, you know all about this, Steve. Here's an answer to this thing.
Yeah.
And that's what they're used to. And if you say, no, there isn't an answer, okay, but I need an answer, but there isn't really an answer. So again, you're right. It creates more anxiety in the context where people think there is an answer to everything. If once I think people think, well, there isn't, and there's multiple options and there's different options and I need to evaluate them, then I think it sort of reduces anxiety in a way. But you're absolutely right. I think it can work both. It can go both ways. Yeah.
Thanks, Rob.
Mark, I'm going to come to your question in a second. But I just want to sort of add, from my perspective, I think part of when my practice kind of got blown open. So when I moved from being, I would say, an HR and L&D practitioner into something that's much more a change practitioner or an OD practitioner, was when I started to really broaden my own definition of what evidence was, and going into organizations and paying attention not just to the quantitative stuff, but really paying attention to the field, really paying attention to some of the more qualitative data, the stories, the power plays that I saw. And I feel like as a practitioner, allowing myself to see that stuff as evidence and still being critical about bias and my perceptions of it really, really shifted my effectiveness for clients. I would say, I mean, you would obviously have to get evidence from my clients around that, but I think there's something really interesting about what you're saying. The way that we hold evidence-based practice can feel very tight. But I feel like if we can expand that in a sensible way and talk about, you know, the phenomena of being in an organization, the experience of being in an organization, and begin to articulate and express that, we end up in a slightly different conversation with senior leaders. We can speak back in a different way than to just go, do you know what, if people don't come back to the office, you're 90%, you're losing 90% of your potential employees. So I'm sort of putting that there. There's not really a question in it. I'm just kind of saying my experience of this was that there was a shift in my practice.
Yeah, and the thing is, I'll say it's a good analogy, but I'll just use it. It's a bit like the family doctor who's very into, say, science and diagnostic tests, but never really listens to people. or their patients, and you could say it's a similar kind of thing that you need that more, or let's put another in organizational context, someone who sort of has a good feel for being an anthropologist, and if they're walking around organizational business, it's going to pick up all kinds of data and information that will help them in terms of saying, what's the issue, what can we do about it, because they pick up all sorts of things. Now, obviously it's got to be a bit more than just a hunch or that mysterious, oh, it's just a culture, I can feel it. That's a starting point, potentially very important.
That's just annoying when you say that, because sometimes that's all it is for me, and I've got to then back. Well, I'm like, I've got this kind of sense that it's like, you know, you and I spoke last week, and I was saying sometimes I do feel that I have a woo-woo part of my practice, which is kind of like, oh, it's a bit oodly-moodly, and then the work is to try and ground that in
exactly,
like to go, what is it that actually I'm sensing here, or how do I articulate that?
It's the same. It's like to take an opposite side. It might, when a sort of scientist is doing an experiment, oh, something doesn't seem right here. It's like a hunch. And they're really important, but it's what you do with that hunch. And I think the dangers are, if it's a CEO saying, I have a hunch that everyone needs to be in the office to be productive, and that's the end of my analysis, that's the problem. To say, I have this hunch, let's investigate it. That's great.
Am I not then confirming my own bias? Like, I've got a hunch and I'll just go looking for the evidence to support that.
And that's why, the other bit, which I haven't talked about yet, is why it's really important, I think, in evidence-based practice in general, to do it with other people. Because essentially, yes, we all have huge confirmation bias, and we are not very good at spotting our own biases. We're actually often quite good at spotting other people. So if you're saying to me, if you say to me, oh, you know, I found this thing and I think this is going on, I say, but Jules, what about that? Or are you saying that, did you look over there as well? And you're like, I didn't. Now I'm going to have to go and look over there, and maybe my hunch is wrong. So I think it's doing other people is incredibly important.
Okay, so yeah, the inconvenient truth that I might be wrong is okay. So that's annoying, but fair enough. I'm going to move, Mark. I'm going to bring you in. I'm so sorry again, like made you wait, but I loved your question. Can you speak for the recording?
Yeah. So Rob, in part, I'm just talking to that. I agree with the model that you've described, or at least sort of have a buy into it. And I think my sort of build on that, certainly, Julie, in terms of your comments a few seconds ago, is that, well, you know, where does the needle point? And probably borrowing some terminology, say, from change, you know, what's the burning platform to change? You know, why do we need to do this? And I talk to this primarily because, you know, I've just spent a couple of years at KPMG, and I was working with their consultants at KPMG. And, you know, the burning platform there was that, you know, they weren't selling enough, and we need to, you know, train our people. So, you know, go through the evidence and you go all the, you know, the sort of consultation. But the reality is, well, where does it hit on the bottom line? Where are some of the metrics? Where does it really start to play out and differentiate so we can understand it? And there's one particular sales process, or part of the selling process, which is called velocity. And velocity really is from that first call until the sale. What's the metric around that? And then when it wasn't until we started to unpack that and look at that in more detail that we could see the opportunity. But the evidence for that opportunity was because we looked at it from a commercial point of view. And we looked at it really with some hard evidence around where does that value go down the value chain and where does it play out? So I'm just, Rob, asking the question, where does, you know, do we need to think more of this in terms of your model? And then the final, probably I'm adding two questions. The reason why I asked this also is because even when there's all the evidence that it is a commercial impact, people still don't change.
Yeah.
And that's evident for me, just literally. And I know people have different views on Gallup and whether Gallup's research methodology is good or bad. But if you look at their latest research that came out, I think, last week in terms of the global employee engagement, well, the UK is in 30th position out of 38. They reckon global employee engagement's dropped from 24 to 21%. And if you look at every metric, certainly below age of 35, most disenfranchised managers are of that age, and women in particular, are really dropped in terms of their employee engagement. So the burning platform there is, you know, the future of organizational success potentially in terms of future managers and leaders being adapt to leading organizations is at risk. But we don't, as organizations, don't seem to recognize that as a key issue. So, you know, there's hard evidence, but what's the there's a burning platform for change, but we still don't want to do it.
Okay, let me do the Gallup thing first. So I would say Gallup is anything but hard evidence. I don't want to get into particular, but Gallup, in my experience, is an extremely untrustworthy source of information. To the point that it's almost entirely commercial. I can't see any other value in what they're trying to do at all. And in fact, if you look at things like job satisfaction, which correlates incredibly highly with employee engagement, it's been pretty stable in the UK for the last 20 years, national level. Same in the US, actually. And Gallup will say things like, oh, you know, people aren't staying in jobs and turnover's happening quickly. But again, for example, in the US and the UK, turnover's pretty stable. So they are trying to create a burning platform to sell more of their stuff, right? So let's put that on one side a minute, and we can maybe talk about that later if you want. The first point you were sort of saying is about the commercial value of this, I think, and the idea that yeah. So I think, to me, this is why the model always starts with a business or organizational issue. It doesn't start with stuff. It doesn't start with let's do L&D, let's do change, let's do whatever. It starts with what is apparently a problem or opportunity, usually commercially, if it's a commercial organization, for this business. What is it? And once you sort of think you've identified it, and that could come from a stakeholder, it could more likely from a senior manager, then you say, great, okay, this is what you think is going on. Right, we're going to go and find out, using this process, what that issue might be. So I think it always starts with a commercial issue rather than about doing stuff. So to me, and again, if it's not commercial, it could be a public good organization, whatever, but it's the same process. You start with what is important for the organization. That's always the starting point. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so I'm gonna chuck some spanners in at this point, because again, the keynote opening here, so learning technologies at Excel, the obsession with AI is real. Mark, there's an awful lot of burning platforms that are being created. The conversations that I'm hearing, both at conference and in the exhibition, people are lighting fires around this stuff. Whether or not they're real, or we can kind of get into that, I suppose. But one of the interesting things was the keynote was Red Thread Research, and I've just Googled it actually. So they've just, in December, they released a whole bunch of research about the impact of AI on HR. And in the research, it was saying that, I'm going to misquote this, so forgive me, but I think it was about 75% of the CEOs that they spoke to were saying that what they wanted was growth. So 75% of the companies were going for growth. And I was sitting in the audience going, I think we're in the wrong conversation. So if the organization is only going for, if 75% of those organizations are all saying that they're going for growth, that is not sustainable. It's just not, right? Like, not everybody can achieve that, or it's the ambition might be there. So I have this real question about sustainability in all of this. I have some real questions about some of the ethics that sit around some of the things that businesses say that they want to do. So Rob, if I take your premise that the business is making this decision and we should be like, there's something that I can't square in the sort of swirly circles in all of this. There's something about being able to create burning platforms, and politically we can often see things being ignited that are just not necessary. And so evidence can get used in very twisty ways. And ethics.
And I think both to Mark's point and your point, Jules, I think the burning platform thing is almost, again, you might say it's commercial, but it's often also equally political. That it's about a person or a couple of people who want something to happen. So they tell a story about there's a burning platform to enable them to take the actions they want to take. And I think the evidence-based practice doesn't sort of necessarily start with burning platform. It says, well, is this, okay, you think it's a burning platform, let's actually go and find out. A lot of those burning platforms might turn out not to be, which might infuriate the people that wanted to say it was a burning platform. But it's, to me, that's okay to start with that position, but then you really have to investigate whether it's a problem. And as a microcosm of this, just because I was posting about it recently, is generational differences at work. So it's a really good example. People create a burning platform. Oh my God, the sixth generation of the workplace, and they want different things, and you know, the 21-year-olds now just completely different sort of species to the 45-year-old. Oh my God, you know, and guess what? All the people saying that will sell you stuff to help you deal with this problem. And of course, the best available evidence suggests there aren't really particularly strong generational difference in terms of work behavior or work attitudes or work values. There might be a few, but it's often age differences, not generational differences. So I think the burning platforms, I think you're right, it's often used, but to me, it's often more of a kind of political thing than actually anything else. And again, back to your point, Jules, about growth and sustainability. Again, in my very limited experience, I'd be interested to know what you think. Often growth is there as a sort of business objective because the senior leaders haven't worked out how to actually develop anything like what might be called a strategy. So all they can think of is growth. It becomes the default. We don't know what we want to do. I know, let's growth, you know.
But what company wouldn't want to grow, I suppose, is, you know, that's the playing it back. And I think for me, just building on crossing the T's and dotting the I's on my point was that actually there's probably more value to explore on what we have today.
Yeah.
And to go in and look at that through a different perceptual positions in terms of what's working and where it's not working, and compare the evidence in terms of different parts of the organization. And that in itself, by improving either skills, capability, processes, that in itself through the right evidence, through your model, but with, for me, this commercial lens attached to it, learning platform or otherwise, potentially then gives the opportunity for growth in organizations, which I don't see as much of a narrative at the moment as it should be. And I think there's an opportunity there for us to think about, you know, the conversation this morning and putting a value to it, as well as just looking at it that there's some truth behind it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I suppose it depends what you mean by growth, but I think there are businesses that don't want to grow. They want to specialize or get better or even get smaller at doing particular things they want to do. So it depends what you want. I think.
Well, I suppose profit would be the ultimate sort of.
Yeah, so you might get more profit by reducing to half the size, of course.
Correct.
So
yeah.
So
I mean, that's what most businesses are in for.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm just having a wee look in the chat. Any other questions that are coming in? Anything that's rising for people that has yet to be asked?
Or I could ask a question to everyone here, so if that's okay. So now you've sort of seen the model and heard the discussion about it. What is in the organizations you've worked with, do you ever see any organizations adopting something a bit like this? And again, the key thing is it's about the principles. And often the model I presented, people often say, well, do you have to follow every single step? No. Do you have to use every source of evidence? No. It's just having some sort of structure and trying to follow it and sticking to the principles. So have you ever worked with organizations who seem to be doing something like this, whether they call it evidence-based or not?
We've got an absolute ton of experience here, so it's going to be interesting to hear. And also if everyone says no, that in itself is something.
It is. And then if everyone's saying no, the next question is, Alex, I think is.
Alex is waving it.
Come on in. We've got you muted, I'm afraid.
You're on mute, Alex. Can you? Yes.
Hello.
Morning. So this isn't really a question, it's a sort of observation. So I work a lot in culture transformation, where there's a lot of read across in all these kind of areas or topics or whatever. And as part of my evidence-based research, shall we say, when I go into an organization, is quite often if it will start off with, this isn't right, we need to do something about it. But, you know, culture is one of these sort of swirly things, as you described, Julie, that people can't quite get their head round. So when I look at the evidence and go through what I call hard data and soft data, that's just kind of the process that I've kind of formatted, is I use an approach called appreciative inquiry, which is when something worked really, really well, what's happening? Because I find sometimes that people look at what they think is the issue and it just becomes a bit of a well, this is wrong and that's wrong and all that kind of stuff. But when you ask people to, you know, when you ask them about their team, when it's working well, what's it doing, suddenly kind of like they just become far more engaged, and you get a slightly different perception on an evidence as to what's happening when things are going really, really well. Let's understand that, and how can we replicate that in other parts of the organization? Or once you understand what's happening, it gives you just a different perspective to perhaps what's not happening or what's not working in different parts of an organization or teams or processes. You know, it's not just one might say behaviors, it's behaviors around processes as well. And obviously there's a big part of it which is about values.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Alex. And I think the values thing as well is something, again, I didn't emphasize much today, but there's absolutely no reason why values isn't part of this as well.
Yeah.
In terms of say, what's the business problem, what we can do about it, values should be driving all that too, because, you know, what determines what's important to our business is in part, even the commercial stuff is driven by what you think the value in both an ethical sense and maybe other kinds of senses is what you're trying to do. And certainly in terms of what can we do about it, you may look at some of the interventions or solutions and they contradict in some way with your values. You want to find others that fit with it better. So I haven't talked about much today, but I think that is absolutely part of it as well. Yeah.
And Alex, I think certainly in the work that I do with GameShift, we often talk to clients about we're going to take an appreciative lens as well as sometimes a deficit lens. But we will say to them, we're going to try and help you also figure out what does work and what is effective. So I love that framing. Chris.
Yeah. No, I was partly going to make that point, and I think appreciative inquiry does the deficit really well. It just comes at it from a different angle. It's not Pollyanna-ish. What I wanted to say, I wanted to go back to Rob's question about what we think about all of this, and I was thinking about the model. I don't know what you call it, Rob. The curvy model with the what's the problem, what do we do about it? Does it have a name?
I didn't give it a name. Some people call it a snake.
Right.
Others call it a serpent, but I'm not sure. Others call it's a bit like DNA or the infinity symbol, but I don't call it anything.
Yeah. So for me, I want to continue it. I think there's another curve to go in, which is, you know, once you start doing something, we can guarantee that some of it won't work and some unexpected things will emerge. And there's evidence in that too, both in seeing the evidence of what's happening and in responding to that. So it kind of loops around.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
One of the models at the core of GameShift's work, and you know, we stand in a long tradition. We always say we stand on the shoulders of giants. Is the Mintzberg Moncrief Ashridge Whirligig, which is a non-linear model of acting into a turbulent world where things won't work, so there's learning loops. Other things happen unexpectedly, so there's learning loops. Other things emerge, so there's learning loops. And you're constantly looking at the quality of the attention paid to what's happening and the attention paid, you could say the rigor of the learning. And Philippa, I saw you were just about to say something and I jumped on in front of you, sorry.
That's okay. I was just going to give a little example in terms of Rob's question about where I've seen it not done very well. I once had a line manager at a business school of my acquaintance, whom it will become clear I didn't think was very effective. And I suspect he actually knew this, which may have been part of the issue. But we had our first meeting after he'd become my line manager. And I said at the end of the meeting, which had been quite challenging at times, because I'd asked him a number of questions. And I said, so how are you leaving this meeting? You know, how has this been? And he said, you know, about us working together in this way. And he said, well, I'll be able to tell at our next meeting. And I said, oh, how come? And he tapped a folder that he had on his desk, which he had been given, which was an HR file on me, which was empty. You know, it was empty. He went, because there'll be paper in here. And I said, but you do have some information already about, your experience of working with me, brackets, I suspect not, entirely positive, because you will feel something in your body, you will have a reaction to how we're working. He absolutely wouldn't engage with it at all, even when I said that one of my colleagues had done a PhD, which he knew about, in embodied knowing. And I think part of it actually was this person's background. I don't think he had bad intent, but his framing was so narrow that actually for him to consider sources of data that weren't pieces of paper in an HR file were just not acceptable. So I think there is something about how can we actually widen out leaders' acceptance of non-traditional data. And that's something that I think, good leaders, I think I experience, are actually very open to it and really like the idea of looking more widely and more qualitatively, but some less capable ones aren't. And just thought I'd share the story.
Yeah.
I'd like to bring in Helen's comment from the chat into Philippa about sometimes like a lack of good data, or what we classify as being kind of good data in organizations. Helen, I don't know if you can say anything, if you're okay to put your mic on, but.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last organization that I worked at, there was an absolute appetite for data. There was a real recognition that a lot of the decisions we were making were not based on data. They were based on experience or gut, and that wasn't the most effective way. The problem we were a global organization. I won't say who we were because we sold some of our systems, but our systems were not good. People systems in particular, from a global perspective as well. The type of data, the quality of the data, the integrity of the data varied across the board. So we went through an investor cycle where, as you will know, huge amount of information is needed. It took weeks of trying to manually pull together information, even for things such as simple as what's your global headcount. So we had a huge blocker in terms of being able, I think there was an appetite with the leaders, absolutely, but to be able to, I suppose, facilitate that was really difficult because we just didn't have the mechanisms in place to be able to pull together, decent data. Yes, some of the anecdotal data, talking to stakeholders, we could do that, but some of the more traditional data we just weren't able to easily access, which made things really difficult.
Yeah, I think if I can respond to that, Helen, I think well, the first thing is, I think evidence-based practice, I know the example you gave is slightly different, but evidence-based practice, you don't necessarily need to have good data or great data. It's the best available data and evidence. So that's one point. The second thing is, I think what's interesting about getting good data, as you put it, within organizations, is how do you know what is going to be good or useful data? And again, what we've certainly seen, I think, in the context of HR information systems, is there isn't always much thought to that. What there's a lot of thought is about collecting lots and lots and lots and lots of data, which is of unclear relevance or value. So rather than saying, well, what do we actually need? It's like the concept of the dashboard. You kind of look at this dashboard and maybe most of the data on it is totally useless or irrelevant to you or bad quality. And I think you only kind of learn as a function or a business what data you need is by going through a process, something like evidence-based practices, because you ask questions, you're trying to answer the questions, you find out what's the data we've got, to your point, what's the data we haven't got, or it's so hard to get hold of this data, we're never going to use it. So that means the next time you come across this problem, you're going to start working on how can we make sure we've got the data we need. So there's often a focus on just generating data and evidence rather than generating data and evidence you actually need to help you do your work better. And you only find out what you need by trying to use data and looking where the gaps are and say, why do we collect this evidence? Nobody uses it, stop collecting it. So those kinds of things, I think you only learn what you need by starting to do it, I think.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
And then there's another couple of points in the chat. So from Amanda again saying that, yes, there is a real, she personally buys into the evidence-based principles. But again, bumping into that power, adamant leadership so that the perennial problem that sits around that.
That's right. In particular, I think in HR, one of the problems is because it's sort of a lot of it is about human behavior. Everyone's an expert on human behavior. So a leader will feel quite confident in, you know, saying what he or she thinks is important for employee motivation without having any just personal experience in a way they wouldn't with an IT system or how you do accounting. But there's something about HR, everyone feels they're an expert in it. And I think it's one of the challenges there is it probably because HR historically has not shown very well that it does have expertise in human behavior. And I think people don't recognize that, but we should know more about motivation than the CEO, but you know, maybe we don't sometimes. So yeah.
Is that because we're seeing humans as resources?
Could well be that, yes. It could be, yeah.
All right. So, oh, Alistair. And like Tim, your point in there about you're sort of starting to see it come into HR culture, and Alistair saying sort of closer to a vision of good evidence practice is where the government process is. Yeah, okay. Alistair,
Can I ask in response to Tim's question, do you think Tim and Rob, calling it evidence-based approach kind of makes it perhaps more acceptable? So I completely get the point about it's just part of how we work, but I wonder partially if describing it as, oh, here's a thing and it's got a process, and it's making it into something that perhaps some leaders might find more acceptable, because it's not just, it's making, to go to your point, Rob, about making HR's work more explicit, more HR's expertise more explicit.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it's a question.
It can also, I think, in the context of medicine, I know when they coined the term evidence-based medicine, there was after a few years, there was a lot of regret about using that term, because the word evidence instead of the beginning is so loaded, and based is sort of so loaded. Instead of saying, you know, information informed practice or something else, it's sort of a bit loaded. But to your point, Philip, I think it may make some people, oh, there's a thing, we can do that thing, can't we? Oh, great. And indeed, Tim's point, I think ideally it should be, at the moment, I see it as an exception to normal organizational practice, that people have an explicit, it doesn't have to be my model, but to have an explicit process for how they say, what's the issue, what we can do about it. It's exceptional that people say, oh yeah, we have a process. We explicit, it's really odd. So I think to have a thing you can cause them, say, here's a process, I think can potentially help. Having said all that, people seem to not like following, it seems to be processes around decision. They want to just do stuff. And if you say, here's a protocol to follow, it's like, oh, do I have to? Can't we just kick things about, come up with something? And yeah, you can, but it's probably not going to be as effective. And it's quite hard to persuade people around that. But I completely take your point. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of our work is in the what we call the exploring space. You know, where it doesn't matter if you got all the experts in the world in a room, they wouldn't be able to tell you the right answer, because nobody knows the answer yet. And what we definitely have a bias towards participatory ways of working, and we kind of own our bias and say, well, if you're not interested in that, don't hire us.
Yeah.
And then we're interested in rigorous curiosity. And we have here Alex, who one of our partners. We explore through all kinds of different ways of knowing, and Alex is a jazz musician and does brilliant work exploring things musically, which gives you another set of data. It's not better, but it's more, it's richer. And then you can come back and say, what did we learn from that? Is there something useful here?
Yeah.
And that's what I like. It's kind of rigorous curiosity. And I've never called it evidence before, but of course it is a kind of evidence.
Yeah,
it is. It's certainly data. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not head data, it's not rational data, it's affective data. I've been on the end of Alex's stuff. I know what it can do. And it's still, but I think we keep making the point about like our definition of evidence can be overly narrow sometimes in our
Folks, I'm just conscious that we're into the last 10 minutes, so can we sort of bear that in mind as we go? Thank you, Tim. Like the appreciation. Very kind.
I just want to go to Alistair then, perhaps as the last point. Alistair, is there anything that you'd like to add to the point that you've made in the chat?
It was just thinking over career and prompted by, I think it was you, Jules, that said the volume of experience. I started work in the chemical industry post the start of health and safety at work. And I've recently worked quite a bit in financial services post 2007-8, where the regulatory context in both situations became very strong and very powerful. And in financial services, in the most recent sort of 10 years or so, worked in a couple of smaller, so not the majors, not the big commercial banks, where the chief risk officer has been really quite good and used the levers and all of the stuff that came post 2008 in terms of SMF, this and this, and my client had as a productive instrumental tool to drive some of the stuff you've crystallized for us this morning, Rob, and that was my response to your where have you seen this work well?
Yeah,
I share the vision. I valued the do you critically think about stuff, Alistair, when you're consulting with your clients, and that was the thought you prompted, Rob, where chief risk officer, internal audit.
Yeah,
I'm a late convert to governance. I used to, reporting to boards, I used to think, well, I know how to do my job. What are you asking? But I am a late, back end of my 50s and in my 60s. I think governance is great, and that's the insight you prompted. Is it maybe where the internal chief risk officer, internal audit, as well as the external framework, be it that in medicine, education I work in, where that's done well?
Yeah. So, yes, it's a really good question. So I quite often ask, where are the sectors where this works, or not works? Are the sectors where this seems to fit more naturally? And I think the answer is yes. I think it's safety critical organisations, and linked to that is any context where you, as an organisation or business, will be required potentially to explain why you did the things you did. If no one's really ever going to ask, unless you really screw up, and if it's in a context where what does really screw up mean anyway, and you can't be, then you will say, oh, we need to really think about this and get the information and evidence we need. So I think those two things. And the other context so the context of HR in particular, it seems to work, is where people are in organizations that have a lot of scientists in them. So I know I've spoken to a few organizations like that, and HR say it's a real pain, because when HR keeps suggesting things, these people who ask questions like, well, why are we doing this? And does it work? And how do you know? And, so they just naturally ask those kind of questions. So that means they have to think a bit more about what they're asking, what they're doing, and why they're asking. So yeah, I think essentially any context where people can ask you to explain, justify what it is you're doing, you're more likely to do this. And I think back to governance, there's a lot of context in which actually it doesn't really matter what you do. No one's ever going to really ask you, or if it kind of works, it kind of go well done you. If it kind of doesn't work, you can blame the consultant that told you to do it, or whatever it is. So there's no real accountability or governance in that sense. So yeah, it's a really good point.
Okay. Rob, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to close
Well.
there because we are going to be out of time. It was really, really interesting. It's brilliant to get into the whole aspect of evidence-based practice, whether that be in HR or across the wider organizational change or commercial offerings that come into it. So thank you, as always. It's really interesting, really thought-provoking. Chris, Philippa, I will hand back over to you. And thanks for your time, Rob. It's been great.
Philippa, do you want to do this, or shall I?
No, go for it. Go for it. It's good for me to practice not speaking.
Okay. Well, from both of us anyway, thank you to Rob and to Jules for holding today. Just to make a link to our next pop-up, and the next one is very soon. It's only a week away, and it fits beautifully into this series of rigorous and effective work in organizations. So if you remember, we've worked with Patricia Riddell, neuroscientist, on debunking some of the myths that pop up on neuroscience. We've worked with Steve on No Silver Bullet. Thank you very much, Steve, for doing that with us. We've worked today with Jules and Rob. And then a week today, we have Mini Kabal Ok from the Management Center Turkey, based in Istanbul, author of various books on philosophy in organizations and bringing rigor and clarity to cut through some of the confusion and mush of organizational language. So that will be very interesting. And it's going under the title of What If Socrates Was Your Non-Executive Director?
I love.
Rick, that is a week today, isn't it? Same time in a week. And can you put the link into the chat?
The link's already there. He's ahead of you. Link's already there.
And we will, of course, we will write to everybody after this with a link to the recording, with a few thoughts of our own reflections on what it's been like being here. But I just want to say thank you. And Philippa, anything you want to say to close?
Just as ever a delight. I'm always really thrilled by the stimulating conversations we have. We always say we had 45 signups, and others I'm sure life will have got in the way. But some of our most interesting conversations are when we just have people who come for the time they're able to come to and just join in and share stories, ask questions, and we're just delighted to be able to have the pop-up. So please, if you can, do come to the next one and bring a friend as well. That's always as you know, these are free and open to anyone. So please do share them with clients, with colleagues. We're always delighted to have anybody come along.
Yeah, these are about introducing good people to good ideas. So please spread the word. Thank you all very much.
And Jules, thank you very much.
I'm going off to chair the rest of Learning Tech today, and Rob, I'm going to carry you with me. I'm going to carry the sense of you, and I'm going to demand people give me evidence for their AI claims. That's my mission today. So thank you so much.
Good luck with that.
Yes, good luck. Good luck to the conference as you come to that.
Thank you.
Thank
all.
you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.